Let's get going. That's all right.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Sarah Saucedo. My topic is foreign aid in sub-Saharan Africa. I want to touch a little bit on what sparked my interest on this topic. Fall quarter, I took this course called Sub-Saharan African Government and Politics. And going into the course, honestly, I kind of realized I didn't know much about Africa. I had this perception that things were kind of bad there, but I always kind of thought it was just naturally that way and that it was the way it was. But through the course, I realized that that wasn't the case. One of the topics that I found really interesting was about the international system and how it impinges on a lot of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So a bit of background about Africa. It is not a naturally bad place. I had this misperception, and I think many people might, that things are kind of, or that Africa is an inherently unstable region. But there's a lot that goes into why it is the way it is. Having said that, there's no getting around the fact that Africa is relatively poor. I have a quote here from Alex Thompson, author of the textbook An Introduction to African Politics. And he stated, the gross domestic product of sub-Saharan Africa in 2007 was still 56 times smaller than that of the United States. When a country fails to develop its economy, hardship inevitably results. So my proposition is that foreign aid is not effectively helping and is instead preventing development of many countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to demonstrate this first by showing that foreign aid is not geared toward long-term development. Second, by showing that foreign aid cannot be effective in countries with weak governance. And lastly, by showing that countries can become dependent on foreign aid. So my first claim, foreign aid is not geared toward long-term development and sustainable growth of the countries receiving assistance. Firstly, aid from governments and big institutions such as the World Bank is not helping to improve countries economically. I have a quote here from Dambisa Moyo, an international economist and author for the Wall Street Journal. She stated, over the past 60 years, at least $1 trillion of development aid has been transferred from rich countries to Africa, yet real per capita income today is lower than it was in the 1970s. And more than 50% of the population, over 350 million people, live on less than $1 a day, a figure that has nearly doubled in 2 decades. And that article was from 2009. That leads into my next point, that the quantity of aid is valued over the quality of aid that's given to Africa. So you have a lot of money coming into these countries, and yet their economies aren't improving, and this money isn't empowering these countries to develop. So my second claim. Foreign aid cannot be effective in countries with weak governance. Firstly, research has found that foreign aid contributes to economic growth in areas consisting of good policy environment. Paul Collier and Jan Willem Gunning stated in 1999 in an article from the American Economic Association that where policies are good, aid substantially raises growth rates. Where they are poor, diminishing returns rapidly set in so that aid cannot significantly contribute to growth. What this shows is that countries with a good policy environment tend to distribute their aid effectively, but those that don't have a good policy environment do not. And unfortunately, it's the case in Africa where many countries, or many of the underdeveloped countries, do not have that type of an environment. That leads also to my next point, that foreign aid can be kept in the hands of the political elite. And I have 2 examples of this. The first is of ex-Malawian President Bakili Malizi. And in a BBC article, it was stated that he was accused of stealing $11 million in donor money. The second example is Mobutu Sese Seko, former president of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And according to Transparency International in 1997, President Mobutu is widely regarded as having systematically looted his country for the past 30 years. And it's claimed that he's stolen $5 billion from his country. So my last claim is that countries can become dependent on foreign aid. So foreign aid does not encourage countries to be innovative economically. An example of this could be food aid. And I have a quote here from the previously stated Dambisa Moyo from the Wall Street Journal. Under the auspices of the U.S. Food and Food for Peace program, each year millions of dollars are used to buy American-grown food that has to then be shipped across oceans. One wonders how a system of flooding foreign markets with American food, which puts local farmers out of business, actually helps better Africa. So to summarize my argument, my proposition was that foreign aid is not effectively helping and is instead preventing countries from developing in Africa. And I talked about how It's not geared towards long-term development and economic growth of countries, about how it's only effective in countries with good governance, and that many countries in Africa are actually led by tyrants and don't have good governance. And lastly, that countries can become dependent on foreign aid because it doesn't encourage them to be, or it doesn't encourage economic innovation. So that concludes my argument. Thank you all for listening.
Right. Structural stuff is fine, but there are a couple of problems with some of the claims that you're presenting. The proposition is really built as two claims, not a single claim, and all of the secondary points use the negative terminology, which makes it a little bit confusing at times, exactly the position that you're taking. I'm not exactly sure there's a lot of controversy over the fact that a lot of this aid is not going to benefit people, especially if you're dealing with the kinds of governments that you're talking about there. And you have two examples that you cite in your own presentation that suggest that aid to countries that where there is endemic corruption or where the leadership is unreliable, that it's not going to produce much because it's going to get diverted or controlled by elites. I think that, like I said, I'm not sure that that's particularly controversial. Do we continue to supply those countries, for instance, with that aid in spite of this, or have we done anything to mitigate those kinds of things? I think that would be where there's a little bit more controversy on the argument. Like I said, the structural stuff is pretty solid, except for the negative terminology. You do signpost the points in the body of the speech, and you're usually explaining ideas pretty well. On that first point, where you're talking about the quality of the aid, it would be helpful to see places where the aid has been effective, where it has produced the desirable outcome that we're looking for, and then try and examine why it is that it was successful in those circumstances, and then contrast that with some of the stuff that's being talked about in the second point. But we don't really get anything that's of a particular there. I think that that's a little bit problematic. The general information that you start with about how poor Africa is, how little economic development there is, I think that's pretty solid. You're showing us how most people there are living on a very small amount of money to begin with. So you would think that the transfer would have made a difference. It sounds like your argument is either the transfers, they become dependent on it, it gets stolen, or it just gets wasted. And I think that there needs to be a little, if we're talking $1 trillion, the $30 billion that got lifted by the one guy in, where was it, Congo, it doesn't sound, it's a lot to you and me, but out of $1 trillion, it doesn't seem like it's that substantial. Isn't that awful? That $30 billion doesn't seem like much out of $1 trillion. Well, it isn't much out of $1 trillion, but so what accounts for the rest of the waste? And it seems to me like there's a good basic argument here, but it needs a little bit more information as to what those failures are. The third point, for instance, I think is a potentially good argument, but it's not developed very well. You've just got this kind of rhetorical question that's being used as proof of that point. The author that you quote sounds like they are knowledgeable and authoritative, but again, their only proof here is a rhetorical question. How could we, is it really going to be productive to send American goods to compete with the local goods there? That's a good question to ask. What's happened in those particular places? Is their economy collapsed? Are there places that we don't give aid and their economies thrive? We're back to the situation where we're being asked to make a comparison here, and I think we're missing the second part of the comparison. You did a good job citing evidence, though, on the points that you had. I thought the sources that you cited were credible for the most part. like I said, there's just some questions about the controversy on this. Yeah, I thought there was a really solid summary of the issues at the end of the speech also. All right, thank you. Kenny,